Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and welcome to Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Dean Zachary Clopton, and I'm so honored to welcome you to the 9th Annual Abraham Lincoln Lecture on Constitutional Law. Before we introduce our esteemed guest, John Fabian Witt, I'd like to thank Professor Stephen Calabresi, the Clayton J. and Henry R. Barber Professor, for endowing this lecture series on constitutional law. Steve's generosity memorializes President Lincoln's connection to the law school and highlights Lincoln's early career as a talented attorney here in Illinois. Please join me in thanking Professor Calabresi for this meaningful gift as we invite him to say a few words to kick off today's event.
So Abraham Lincoln is the United States' best lawyer president, and he is, along with George Washington, one of the two greatest presidents of all time in American history. In his Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858, Lincoln brilliantly pointed out the many ways in which the U.S. Supreme Court's Dred Scott v. Sanford decision was wrongly decided. And he argued in almost every speech that that decision was repugnant and ought to be overruled. In doing this, President Lincoln set a lawyerly standard for how to fight back against an unconstitutional ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court. In his first inaugural address, President Lincoln made a constitutional case in which he held, like a court, that the unilateral secession of the southern states was unconstitutional. He pledged to win what he called the War of the Rebellion, and he lived just long enough to see that victory achieved. The U.S. Supreme Court ultimately wrote Lincoln's first inaugural address into the U.S. Code in Texas versus Witt, which described the Union as being an indestructible union of indestructible states. President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, freed 3 million of the 4 million enslaved Black Americans at that time in the United States, earning Lincoln the well-deserved title of the Great Emancipator. In part as a result, free enslaved people and other free Black Americans constituted 20% of the Union Army, which crushed the Southern Rebellion. The contribution that the freed slaves made to crushing the War of the Rebellion is not as widely appreciated as it should be, and the Emancipation Proclamation was a presidentially issued document written with Lincoln's expertise as a lawyer, and it was not an act of Congress. The Emancipation Proclamation is without a doubt the greatest presidential executive order in American history, and it changed the War of the Rebellion from being a war to keep the Union together into being a war to free the enslaved Black Americans. It's no accident that with Lincoln's help in January of 1865, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery was ultimately ratified. The Northwestern Pritzker School of Law is descended from a law school founded in 1859 as the Union College of Law of the old University of Chicago. And that law school canceled classes for 1 week so its students could go to court for 5 days to watch the great lawyer Abraham Lincoln argue a case. Our faculty at that time recognized Lincoln's extraordinary talents as a lawyer. Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, completed his study of law and received his law degree from our law school, and the law school ultimately became known as Northwestern Law School in 1891 and is today the Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. I endowed this lectureship in constitutional law in Abraham Lincoln's name because of his Northwestern ties, because he was a brilliant lawyer, and most important of all, because he was the great emancipator who ended slavery and kept the Union together by crushing what he and I both call the War of the Rebellion. I admire Lincoln immensely, and I hope this gift will lead to his lawyerly legacy being better appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. And we are honored today to welcome Professor John Fabian Witt to present his lecture, Presidents, Social Movements, and the World They Make, Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt from the perspective of the second Trump term. In today's lecture, Professor Witt discusses the role of presidents in shaping and being shaped by social movements, a topic of renewed interest today. In the midst of today's current polarization, the stories of Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt show how presidents can arise out of and remake the social movements of their day in strikingly different ways. John Fabian Witt is the Duffy Class of 1960 Professor of Law at Yale Law School and a Professor of History at Yale University, where he teaches and writes on the history of American law and the law of torts. He is the author of 6 books, including The Radical Fund, How a Band of Visionaries and $1 Million Upended America, and Lincoln's Code, The Laws of War in American History, which won the Bancroft Prize, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, was awarded the American Bar Association Silver Gavel Award, and was a New York Times notable book. And you knew that you were going to get a civil procedure reference from me. John wrote one of my favorite articles on civil justice, The Inevitability of Aggregate Settlement, in the Vanderbilt Law Review with Sam Issacharoff. Read that one too if you have the time. Professor Witt is a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellow, a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a former head of college at Yale's Davenport College. He holds a BA, JD, and PhD from Yale, and served as a law clerk to Judge Pierre Laval on the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. Please join me in welcoming Professor John Fabian Witt.
Thank you, Dean Clopton. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here today. Brett Gould took good care of me, getting me here. Diane Miller took great care of me. The Dean's office has been gracious. And it's especially nice to be on a podium near Stephen Calabrese, who's been an honorary member of the New Haven intellectual community for years now. And when I was the head of one of Yale's residential colleges, became a regular participant in the life of the students and added immensely to it. So it's really nice to be here today. Nice, too, to see the faces of friends and colleagues on the faculty here whom I've admired for years, and also new faces I'm looking forward to getting to know. I was thrilled to get this invitation, not only because of the distinction of this lecture series, although I confess a little bit of that too, maybe, but because I'd been looking for some way for some time to think about how to stitch together 2 of the projects that have meant the most to me in my work over the course of the last decade or so. You've got the titles right here in front of you, The Radical Fund, a book that just came out this past fall, which is about the 20th century and the making of 20th century liberal constitutionalism, a thing that is in collapse around us and has been for some time. And then before that, the Lincoln's Code book, which is about the creation of a new model for the laws of war in the 19th century, in an earlier moment about 150 years ago now. We assemble here today in an America that seems scrambled, maybe reshaped by the rise of a movement and a president, the MAGA movement, and Donald J. Trump, a populist coalition that fuses long-standing grievances about issues like globalization, demographic change, technocratic expert authority, and more into a powerful political force. And it occurred to me that both of these books, in different ways, had stories like that at their heart. Powerful mobilizations, new social formations that produced presidents that were able to make change, and yet also presidents who were changed by the movements that created them. And in this sense, at least, along this dimension, if along a few others, the highly distinctive, sometimes bizarre and disturbing features of our Trump presidency might not be so singular, I thought. Maybe there would be parallels I'd be able to find connecting up the stories that I've told with the world that we live in today. The entanglement between presidents and social movements has been a recurring feature of American political development. It's been a recurring feature. Students of political science who examine the relationship. This is I'm out of order with my slides. I'm so thrilled to be here, I forgot about the slides. There are scholars who've done this before. People like Sidney Milkis, Daniel Tickner, Laura Blessing, Doug McAdams, Sidney Tarrow, and others have described this relationship between presidents and social movements as fraught with tension, in no small part because the movements often seek to undermine or destabilize features of the very world that produces presidencies. Trump and MAGA offer an occasion for thinking anew about this entangled relationship. And I propose this afternoon, I will go quickly. The chairs look severely vertical. And so I'll try to move quickly and adroitly through what might be an idiosyncratic, but hopefully not wildly self-indulgent tour of two presidencies that my recent work has come up against. And as it happens, they're two of the most momentous American presidencies, Abraham Lincoln and not George Washington, but FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. And their stories might give us a little bit of analytic distance, a little bit of perspective on the tumultuous world we're in today. Now, I have not been, confessional now, a scholar of the presidency per se. My work has been organized around social formations, social movements, legal intellectual frameworks and institutions, but the presidency keeps popping up and imposing itself on my stories, just as our present unruly presidency seems to keep imposing itself on our lives on a day-by-day basis. And in Lincoln's Code, a presidency occasioned by social movements for free soil, abolition, and the like, confronted an inherited law of war framework and transformed it in ways propelled by the momentum of the social wave that Lincoln rode into office. In the Radical Fund, on the other hand, a new set of social formations incubated in exile during the flapper craze and the jazz age of the 1920s emerged in the new context of the catastrophe of the Great Depression to propel Franklin Roosevelt into the White House. Those formations conditioned Franklin Roosevelt's legacy just as much as the earlier ones had pressed on Lincoln's. But in both cases, I'll try to describe to you here today, presidents came to have powerful feedback effects on the formations that helped to make them and that sometimes seemed to press them into action. We may be seeing something along just these lines today, and I'll try to come back to that at the end. So, the social movements that propelled Lincoln into the White House grew out of the astonishing social ferment of the 1840s and 1850s, a period of raucous political plasticity with deep parallels to our moment today, sometimes too deep given the calamities that followed fast on their heels in the 1860s. An array of overlapping and fractious anti-slavery movements in the North pressed for an end to mass human enslavement in the South. Meanwhile, what Kate Mazur in this university's history department calls the first civil rights movement insisted on emancipatory readings of the Constitution for free black people in the country. The Free Soil movement, organized around a platform of free territories in the West, emerged as a political force in the election of 1848 under the rallying cry, free soil, free labor, free speech, and free men. The party didn't call for abolition in the South, only that land in the West should be kept open for free, mostly white settlers, rather than dominated by slave plantations. The ideas and social project on which this movement rested mixed moral objection to slavery with an economic objection to the institution and a desire to protect mostly white interests in free labor. In the wild politics of the 1850s, among bleeding Kansas, Fugitive Slave Act battles, and eventually John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, the Free Soil movement birthed a new party, the Republican Party. Scholars Doug McAdams and Sidney Tarrow cite three social factors in this story: the massive antebellum shift in population and voters from North to the New West, the widespread interpretation of Southern versus Northern and westward expansion as a zero-sum game between slave agriculture on the one hand and smallholder farming on the other, and a coalition of free soil-seeking Westerners and anti-slavery Northerners. McAdam and Tarrow say that these are the factors that lay behind the formation of the Republican Party, and it's impossible to understand the rise to prominence of an obscure frontier politician facing me across the room from that New West, Illinois' own Abraham Lincoln, outside these forceful mobilizations behind the new Free Soil anti-slavery coalition. Lincoln was a product of that coalition, and his presidency was a product of its surging social power. My Lincoln's Code book is about what the rise of this Northern and Western electoral coalition meant for the future of slavery, and also what it meant for the centuries-old legal framework of the law of nations. Lincoln's initial war message to Congress in 1861 framed the conflict solely as a rebellion against lawful government, and famously, Lincoln insisted that his paramount object in the struggle was to save the Union, and that if he could save it by freeing all the slaves, freeing none of them, or freeing some but not others, he'd do whatever course was required for the nation's preservation. My interest in Lincoln's Code was to observe that the customs and usages of war stood in the way of the political mobilization that had brought the nation to war. Going back exactly 87 years from 1862, not 1863, we go to the 1775 declaration by the last royal governor of the colony of Virginia, announcing that he would free the slaves of American rebels. And ever since then, American statesmen had adopted a strident position in the laws of armed conflicts. Slaves, they insisted, were private property, and private property under the Enlightenment laws of war was not a legitimate target for an enemy's army. Slave societies, moreover, they added, were vulnerable to humanitarian catastrophe in wartime. For planters and for American statesmen in the State Department, the horrors of the Haitian Revolution of the 1790s were said to stand for this proposition. It shocked the conscience to free an enemy's slaves in wartime. Warfare in an ostensibly enlightened, civilized mode was not, anyway, supposed to alter the basic social and civic fabric of the enemy's society. It was to remain between armies. Now, all these features of the laws of armed conflict, as they were articulated in the late 18th century and then forcefully re-articulated to defend slavery by American statesmen in the early 19th century, weighed on Lincoln in the first year and a half of war. And of course, they dovetailed with the shape of his political coalition, which had arisen, after all, not to undo slavery in some violent thunderclap, but to contain it, perhaps with the effect of letting it die out over time. It was no wonder, then, that Lincoln's initial reactions to emancipatory orders from his commanders in the field were negative. He was clear to General John Fremont in September 1861. The laws of war did not admit of emancipation in wartime. But by the summer and early fall of 1862, this posture had exhausted itself as a strategic matter. And when Lincoln formulated the Emancipation Proclamation in the summer and fall of that year, publishing it in January 1st of 1863, he justified it under the very rules of war that American statesmen had relied on for 80 years to oppose emancipations in wartime. He called it an act of justice rooted in military necessity. And in precisely the same weeks, Lincoln and his top command initiated the project of rewriting the laws of war. Civilized belligerents asserted a code they commissioned from the impassioned Columbia law professor Francis Lieber, do all in their power to help themselves or hurt the enemy, except a few things regarded as barbarous or cruel. And that included, that is, the affirmative powers included freeing enemy slaves now. Lincoln had reversed the long-standing American tradition. And crucially, it also involved the arming of black soldiers and the insisting on their entitlement to the privileges of legitimate combatants, including the right to be treated as prisoners of war when captured. The treatment of black soldiers was a flashpoint that exposed the abolition movement's growing influence on Lincoln's wartime policy. The Confederacy refused to treat black soldiers and their white officers as prisoners of war. The official position of the South was that such men were fugitive slaves, insurrectionists, and criminals rather than soldiers. They were thus not eligible for exchange. They were fit for criminal prosecution and, in appropriate cases, re-enslavement or execution, as the criminal laws of the Confederacy's member states saw fit. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, was enraged by the Lincoln administration's lack of response to these policies. He wrote searing editorials condemning Lincoln's silence regarding the execution of black prisoners and the danger that captured soldiers would be returned to bondage. Douglass demanded a policy of reciprocal punishment, one Confederate execution for every black soldier murdered as a prisoner of war. Douglass's demand was no idle threat. By the summer of 1863, the Union Army had a manpower problem. Draft riots in New York, participated in by some of my ancestors, illuminated the difficulty Lincoln would have in recruiting more white soldiers. My great-great-great-grandfather, unlike some of his cousins, signed up in the same summer for a second 2-year term of enlistment. But in that moment, white enlistees were all too few, and free black abolitionists across the North made clear that any recruitment of new black soldiers would depend heavily on Union policy toward the Confederacy's treatment of black soldiers. The United States may as well disband the colored troops if it did not live up to its obligations, said one black New Yorker. Now, there were huge costs to adopting the policy that the abolitionist movement pressed on Lincoln. To insist on the protection of black soldiers, as Lincoln and his generals well knew, was to bring an end to the prisoner exchanges that had reunited captured white Union soldiers and their families for 2 years. With an end to exchange came the prison camp horrors described in W. Fitzhugh Brundage's promising new book, A Fate Worse Than Hell. It's just come out this week, so I confess I haven't read it, but I'm excited to dive in. These horrors, the horrors of Andersonville and the like, meant the fury of white families whose husbands and sons and fathers would be consigned to those deadly places in Andersonville in Georgia and others as the price for the principle of equality for black soldiers. A New York journalist and poet named Walt Whitman thought that this decision was a terrible mistake by the Lincoln administration. And yet, under uncompromising pressure from the abolitionist and civil rights movements of the North, Lincoln of the Free Soil Party legacy issued a retaliatory order on July 30th, 1863, that stands as one of the most astonishing, though little recognized and remembered, egalitarian moments in our history. The order denied enemies the right to declare unlawful any soldier on the basis of class, color, or condition. It followed Lieber's code to a word in insisting that the laws of nation permitted no distinction of color to sell or enslave a captured person. Lincoln's order called the decision to sell or enslave a relapse into barbarism, and he promised to execute a Confederate prisoner for any Union prisoner killed in violation of the laws of war, black or white. He stopped short of ordering executions in retaliation for enslavements, as Lieber's rules would have permitted, but he provided that for every Union prisoner enslaved, one rebel soldier would be put to hard labor. The retaliatory order of July 1863 had at least some of its intended effect. The Confederate government retreated from its strong initial position and discouraged public criminal proceedings against black soldiers. Field executions, however, seem very clearly to have become the preferred alternative. The dreadful massacre of black soldiers at Fort Pillow in Tennessee in 1864 was only the most infamous such episode in what became an epidemic of informal executions. Lincoln famously had little stomach for the type of policy that he eventually adopted in the retaliatory order, the execution policy in particular. It was pressure from Douglass and black abolitionists that forced the administration to confront the contradiction between proclaiming emancipation and failing to protect those who fought for it. If emancipation and retaliation showed Lincoln responding to movement pressure, however, the post-war and Reconstruction revealed a presidential coalition pushing back and redefining the movement's aims. Charles Sumner, the anti-slavery senator from Massachusetts, stood as a leader of the Senate's radical faction. He was the movement in the Republican Party, and for radicals like Sumner, Reconstruction was not a matter of simply restoring civil government in the seceded states after formal emancipation. It required, he insisted, sustained federal and specifically military oversight of the defeated South. The former Confederate states, in Sumner's view, were conquered provinces or forfeited territories subject to congressional control and military authority. The laws of war, Sumner was friends with Francis Lieber, would supply the legal authority and the state capacity to suppress white supremacist violence and secure the civil and political rights of freed people. Institutions such as the Freedmen's Bureau would be the great administrative state machinery of emancipation. It would be the essential institution for enforcing labor contracts, establishing schools, adjudicating disputes, and protecting free people from being forcibly returned to variations on their pre-war status, not to mention new, fresh horrors. Or at least so thought the radicals of things like the Freedmen's Bureau. Lincoln's relationship to the war's resolution was, of course, interrupted by the assassin's bullet, but so far as we can tell, he balked at much of this sweeping military vision of Reconstruction. Lincoln toggled back and forth between an invocation of a war authority that seemed to imply that the Confederacy was an independent state on the one hand, and an insistence that, of course, the Confederacy was no such thing. The central story of the first years of Reconstruction was consistent with Lincoln's initial instincts that the Confederacy was no such thing. It entailed a move from military and administrative Reconstruction to conventional constitutional mechanisms. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, was like an entire constitution of its own, considered by some to be the beginning of a new constitutional story. It also marked a kind of ending, and in some sense, a betrayal of the aspirations of the movement people like Douglas and Sumner. Recall that in the train of the Union armies and in the immediate aftermath of the war, Reconstruction had operated under the expansive authority of the war power, with federal troops, military commissions, and the Freedmen's Bureau enforcing emancipation and protecting freed people on the ground. The 14th Amendment helped usher in a redirection of authority from military enforcement to the only other federal institution on the ground, namely the federal courts. Yet the courts lacked the institutional capacity to do the jobs with which they were charged, and once adopted, the 14th Amendment further weakened wartime authority by diminishing the constitutional weight of the grasp of war theory that Sumner had used, and others, to justify a radical federal action through the Freedmen's Bureau and the Army. Historian Gregory Downes's After Appomattox, published about a decade ago now, illustrates the point. As United States soldiers departed the states of the so-called former Confederacy, the conditions of freedom on the ground receded accordingly. The 14th Amendment, then, ultimately marked not only the beginning of the constitutional world in which we live today, but also the end of an early vision of the Reconstruction project, and an ending that compromised many of its key goals, sacrificing the protection of freedmen for what was more often than not merely an illusion of equality and liberty that the 14th Amendment had purported to guarantee. Participation in the political movement of the presidency, the political coalition of the presidency, had turned out to have feedback effects for the movement. It wasn't only that the amendment path and the courts were all that Sumner and his allies could get. That would be one thing. But engagement with the political coalition of the Republican Party, of Lincoln's coalition, helped to redirect the movement, altering its conceptions of what counted as its goals, channeling its ambitions into a particular legal framework, and deflecting the energy that had all too briefly propelled the Freedmen's Bureau and military administration. Let's jump forward about 60 years. Franklin Roosevelt's presidency was also occasioned by new social formations of his day. By the time Roosevelt ran for president in 1932, amid economic catastrophe and industrial chaos, the groundwork had been laid for a new political coalition, not of the Republican Party, but of the Democratic Party, arguably for the first time since the end of the Civil War. After all, it's Republican domination of American federal government from the end of the Civil War, essentially all the way to the Roosevelt administration, with exceptions that we could talk about. From the 1880s until World War I, immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe coming to places like Toledo, Ohio, pictured here in 1934, at a strike outside a rubber factory, had remade the political coalition of the Democratic Party in the North. My most recent book, The Radical Fund, is about the industrial labor movement in incubation through the 1920s that helped shape the first and second generation immigrant labor force into a foundation for Franklin Roosevelt's political coalition. A mostly forgotten foundation known as the American Fund for Public Service, better known as the Garland Fund, quietly helped fund efforts to mobilize the new industrial working class. The Radical Fund examines the network of activists, organizers, intellectuals, civil libertarians, and civil rights figures who crafted an overlapping set of social movements in the 20s that would later give shape to the New Deal. Its key figures included people like Roger Baldwin, the founder of the American Civil Liberties Union, and Sidney Hillman, who as leader here in Chicago of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America was helping to pioneer an innovative form of industrial bargaining rather than occupational bargaining in the American labor movement. The Garland Fund is best known where it is known at all, which I concede is relatively few places, though I'm trying to change that. As the foundation that launched in 1930, the litigation campaign that led in 1954, almost a quarter century later, to Brown against Board of Education. The fund's money financed the NAACP's famous full-page anti-lynching ads announcing the shame of America. The fund handled the ACLU's costs in the Scopes monkey case, but its principal work in the 1920s was in fostering a labor movement in exile during labor's lean years of the 1920s. And in time, that connected it up to what was quietly becoming the foundation of the coalition that would sustain FDR's unprecedented 4 elections to the White House. We can get a little bit of a glimpse of this coalition and the coalition that was remaking the Democratic Party in Frank Murphy. Frank Murphy, Democratic Party Detroit trial judge in the 1920s, who built a mixed-race, working-class political base in Michigan. In 1925, Murphy presided over the trial of Ossian Sweet, a black doctor in Detroit who moved his family into a white neighborhood in the midst of the Great Migration, only to see a race riot on his front lawn. Detroit authorities prosecuted the Sweet family when a white rioter was killed on the sidewalk, leaving unprosecuted any of the white rioters. The foundation, the Garland Fund, paid for Clarence Darrow, who'd just come off the Scopes monkey case, to represent the Sweet family in a trial in front of Judge Murphy, and Darrow got the Sweet family off. Murphy's conduct in the trial distinguished him as a notable racial liberal. 5 years later, Murphy's cross-race, immigrant, and Great Migration coalition swept him into the Detroit mayor's office over an opponent openly supported by the Ku Klux Klan. Murphy sealed his victory with the promise of what he called, in 1932, a New Deal for Detroit. In 1932, Mayor Murphy would campaign for Franklin Roosevelt to be president on the platform of an extended New Deal for the nation, not just for Detroit. Observers credited Murphy with nearly doubling the Democratic Party's vote tally in Detroit's black wards, which historically, of course, had voted for the party of Lincoln. Roosevelt won the state with 52% of the vote, becoming the first Democrat to take the state's electoral college votes since Grover Cleveland in 1892. And 4 years later, the swiftly expanding New Deal coalition of the state swept Murphy into the governor's mansion. Murphy's overlapping social formations were the same ones that sustained FDR's presidency. The labor unions that had been in the wilderness in the 1920s emerged as a crucial part of the emerging new Democratic Party coalition. Union membership doubled from 1934 to 1940. Black voters swung sharply toward Roosevelt all around the country in the same years, cementing the transition of black voters away from the party of Lincoln. Just as important, the intellectuals and organizers who had been quietly training behind the scenes for a decade, many of them faculty and staff at labor colleges set up by the American Fund for Public Service, emerged as insiders and technicians, shaping the terms of FDR's most significant efforts to remake American capitalism. The Great Depression and the Roosevelt administration created an opportunity to put into action the industrial union ideas that had been circulating in the world of Hillman and the American Fund for a decade. The National Industrial Recovery Act, the centerpiece of the president's first 100 days, bid to fundamentally remake the basic structure of the still spluttering American economy. Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins, had briefly herself been attached to the American Fund in the Foundation's first year. Hillman's lieutenants and much of the American Fund world flooded into positions on the Act's Labor Advisory Board. The National Labor Board, also created by the National Industrial Recovery Act, implemented key pieces of the industrial democracy project that Sidney Hillman and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America had tried to put in place here in Chicago. Industrial union economists and lawyers crafted the majority rule and the exclusive representation principle for union elections to shore up labor power. They crafted industrial bargaining units, and as the National Industrial Recovery Act stumbled and crashed in 1934 and 1935, they staffed the committees around New York Senator Robert Wagner, who was hard at work crafting the legislation that would replace the tottering NERA. Brainstorming sessions around Wagner aimed for nothing short of establishing a new industrial democracy, and Roosevelt signed Wagner's labor relations bill into law on July 5th, 1935. The new law, he announced, defines as part of our substantive law the right of self-organization of employees for the purpose of collective bargaining. There were the majority rule and exclusive representation arrangements that the American Fund world technicians and economists and specialists, funded by the Garland Fund for a decade, had adapted from Hillman's Clothing Workers, arrangements fostered at its labor colleges all through the period. The Wagner Act is much contested today. Over time, it has failed to keep up with the changing nature of American capitalism. In its time, however, it was, in the words of one prominent labor historian, the most radical reform of American capitalism in American history. But here's the thing. Roosevelt had been no radical. He had been no labor movement advocate in his career until his presidency. It was not Roosevelt's agenda that produced the Wagner Act. It was the movement's vision, partly technocratic, partly grassroots, that designed it and propelled it into law. Presidents become presidents, but they are subject to the power of the social formations and coalitions that put them into office. A second push by movement example for Roosevelt. In 1941, more Wagner Act. In 1941, this man, A. Philip Randolph, walked into the White House, accompanied by the head of the NAACP, by then a man named Walter White. Randolph, as a young 20-something socialist soapbox orator in Harlem, had gotten a grant from the Garland Foundation to help sustain and create an organization known as the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Over the course of the next decade and a half, Randolph turns the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the organization designed to unionize the black porters on Pullman Car Company, that is just south of here, right? Pullman Car Company sleeping cars. And Randolph turns, with Garland Fund money, the Brotherhood, into the first great black labor union of the 20th century. He actually fails for years to get a collective bargaining agreement from the recalcitrant giant Pullman Car firm. But in 1937, just days After the U.S. Supreme Court upholds the Wagner Act in the spring and summer of 1937, the Pullman Car Company gives in, and Randolph finally gets his collective bargaining agreement. 4 years later, he is, by all accounts, the strongest black labor union leader in the country. And when he goes into the White House in the summer of 41, it is to demand an order, an executive order from Roosevelt desegregating the defense industries. He has 100,000 black union members and others prepared to march on Washington. It is the March on Washington movement. And the distinctive feature of this meeting is that Roosevelt is desperate to cave. Roosevelt needs this march not to happen. The eyes of the world in early 1941 are on the new power of the United States. Can the United States organize itself to be a participant in the geopolitical chaos of the world? Roosevelt is desperate to keep the march off the streets of Washington, and so he issues Executive Order 8022, desegregating the defense industries. It is the beginning of a story that leads to Fair Employment Practices Commissions and eventually gets us to the 1944 case, Steele against Louisville and Nashville Railroad at the U.S. Supreme Court, and then in 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 64. That 8022 pushed by the movement successfully. But it is not the case that the movement was able always to push Roosevelt and get what it wanted. It was also the case, and especially around areas of race, this is Randolph after his successful collective bargaining agreement, it was also the case that feedback effects by FDR had real effect. The March on Washington movement figures as an example of movements pushing presidents, but it was also connected to the racial limits of the New Deal. And here we can start to see some of those feedback effects. The racial structure of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal legislation offers a powerful example of how investing in presidents by movements can produce recursive effects that reshape and deform social mobilizations. The American Fund had hoped to make cross-race labor organizing one of its central projects. In the era of the Great Migration, Hillman's industrial unions needed to sweep workers from all ranks and all occupations into bargaining units if they were to organize workers in the new giant firms of mass production capitalism. That's why Hillman's Circle had drawn Randolph in the first place. It was why the Fund's 1920s labor colleges had carefully inculcated mixed-race student bodies. But the New Deal legislation that Roosevelt signed was designed by his political coalition in the Congress to disproportionately exclude black Americans from their purview. The Wagner Act, the Social Security Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, each of these landmark bills excluded domestic and agricultural labor at the insistence of Southern white Democrats who were still indispensable to the president's political coalition. The Social Security Act's boundaries excluded the majority of black Americans from Social Security insurance protections as late as the 1950s. Local administration of government assistance programs, including the GI Bill, meant that its benefits reached too few black Americans. Discriminatory practices flourished. Black Americans' access to home ownership and generational wealth accumulation suffered accordingly. As Ira Katz-Nelson and others have helped us see, Southern Democrats wielded an enormous influence over national legislation. The same structural exclusions appeared in the National Labor Relations Act, the New Deal's landmark statute protecting workers' rights to organize and establishing a collective bargaining system. The Act's system of exclusive majority representation, which was the glory of the labor colleges and the Garland Fund world of labor economists, often placed black workers under the authority of Jim Crow unions that either excluded them outright or marginalized their interests. No wonder the NAACP objected to the majority rule and exclusive representation provisions of the Act. Just think, a cross-race labor project pressed the New Deal presidency like no other movement had before. The result was an astonishing alteration in American capitalism, the National Labor Relations Act, putting in place a collective bargaining system that is still limping along, though it sometimes is, the closest a mass production economy has gotten to industrial democracy. But the law's carve-outs and its effects on minority workers exacerbated the very fault lines that threatened to undo the social movement itself. Black-white divisions would remain one of the working class's central political vulnerabilities. Lingering bitterness over the racial legacy of the New Deal continues to divide Americans along racial lines to this day. FDR's presidency both sustained working class power and famously planted the seeds of the collapse of the New Deal order. Feedback effects strike again. Let me close with 3 observations about presidencies. It looks like you've been looking at one of them for some time without me even noticing. 3 observations about presidencies and social movements from this purposefully idiosyncratic, as I say, I hope not self-indulgent review. First, occasions. For both Lincoln and FDR, pre-existing social mobilizations were necessary conditions of presidential power. The frontier lawyer from Illinois famously would not have risen to the White House without the anti-slavery and free soil movements that reorganized Northern politics and made the Republican Party possible. Roosevelt would not have succeeded in becoming president, especially not succeeded in being reelected 3 times, without the urban immigrant and industrial labor formations that were reshaping the Democratic Party into the 1920s and 1930s. These presidents were not self-generated phenomena. They were occasioned by movements that had already begun transforming the political landscape. But second, consequences of these pre-existing social formations. Once in office, these movements pushed presidents to take actions they likely would not have taken on their own. Frederick Douglass and the black abolitionists would force a Lincoln to confront the contradiction between emancipation and the treatment of black soldiers. Third, feedback loops. The story doesn't end with presidential responsiveness to movement demands. Movements are also remade by the presidents they helped to create. Presidential Reconstruction and then the congressional Reconstruction policies of the party of Lincoln conditioned and constrained the radical anti-slavery vision that abolitionists had glimpsed in Emancipation and the 1863 Retaliation Order. Roosevelt's New Deal industrial unionism institutionalized industrial democracy, but embedded racial exclusions and majoritarian features that fractured the cross-racial labor coalition its architects had imagined. Presidents are neither puppets of movements nor wholly independent on them. They operate within inherited frameworks. Yet once empowered, they generate new institutional structures that feed back into and transform the mobilizations from which they come. All of which brings me back to Donald J. Trump and the disordered era of dizzying, seemingly continuous political mobilizations and counter-mobilizations in which we find ourselves today. What to make of the patterns visible in past presidencies and their relations to social movements in making sense of our own? Well, for one, we should start with some major differences, and we won't go into all of them, but Donald J. Trump's brilliant instincts as a political communicator and the technologies he has to deliver those exist in ways that neither Lincoln nor FDR had the reach or power to do, radio fireside chats to the contrary notwithstanding. And the power of the presidency is far greater today, vastly increasing the scope of the feedback effects that presidents can have. On the other hand, President Trump has inherited a world of inchoate, aggrieved, popular dissatisfactions that formed themselves into an identifiable structure even before his first presidency. What can be said about his relationships to the social formations that he has inherited? There's some real similarities, I submit, and I submit that we've been able to see them over the course of just this last month. Minnesota's Operation Metro Surge was the 1863 retaliation order moment of the second Trump presidency, a policy project passionately held and pushed by a key piece of the MAGA coalition in a strategically powerful position in that movement that exacted a substantial political cost on the president. There's a further political parallel, I think, maybe, to the costly sit-down strikes of FDR's second term, strikes that Frank Murphy in Michigan notably refused to break before himself losing the next governor's race and becoming Roosevelt's attorney general. In turn, The Iran war, in which President Trump has now thrown us, is the feedback effect. Open-ended foreign wars, of course, were one of the central grievances animating the angry swirl of constituencies Trump has mobilized. But now, only in the last few days, are we seeing the feedback effects of the new supercharged American presidency for the social formations indispensable to their electoral successes. The disarray and feelings of betrayal among leading MAGA voices in the last few days are evidence of this. It's a story, I suggest, as old as democratic politics. The social movements that produce presidents thereby wield power and become vulnerable in doing so. The thing to watch is whether the new super presidency of the 2020s, with its communications megaphone and its novel, untested unitary executive powers, will be able to decisively alter the patterns of the past, the patterns of pressure and feedback loops, and make feedback loops, the feedback effects, the dominant part of the dynamic. I'd love to have the opportunity to hear your reactions and have a little bit of a conversation, but thank you very much for your time. In the glare, I can sort of see things. I see Stephen right here. He's out of the glare. I think there's a microphone coming around. I understand.
Great. Thank you, John, for one of the very best Lincoln lectures we've ever had, which is saying a lot. And I wanted to ask you if you could comment on one of the similarities between Lincoln and FDR is that they both died in office. But a real difference is the vice presidents who succeeded them. And arguably the failure of the 14th Amendment and of the whole civil rights effort was because Lincoln decided he needed to run with Andrew Johnson on a unity ticket because otherwise he was going to lose the general election in 1864. Turned out that wasn't true. He didn't know that in early September, Union forces would capture Atlanta and sever the Confederacy in two, and that he would have won with Hannibal Hamlin anyway, but he thought he needed to compromise, and he picked Andrew Jackson. FDR, in contrast, miraculously picked Harry Truman, who I think is one of the really great presidents in American history, and who I think really realized a lot of the agenda of racial progress that you were talking about. Of course, Truman desegregated the armed forces. He appointed a civil rights commission, which recommended a statute like the 1964 Civil Rights Act. He created the foreign policy world we still live in with the NATO alliance and the United Nations. He appointed Eleanor Roosevelt to be the first ambassador to the United Nations, and she produced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which condemned racism and sexism. And then President Truman also laid the groundwork for Brown v. Board of Education. I mean, once Truman had desegregated the armed forces and taken the actions he'd taken, it was much easier, I think, for the Supreme Court to follow along behind. So my question is, any thoughts on the differences, the differences between these two presidents in this respect? And the one thing I can say in Lincoln's defense is he left behind Ulysses S. Grant, and Grant tried mightily, and I think he's a much better figure than history has remembered him as, but he didn't succeed the way Truman succeeded, and part of the reason that FDR was so successful is because Truman went on to be so successful for 7 years. Any thoughts?
It's a great question. I think the microphone's going to travel. A great question. It seems to me that one of the central things going on here is the significance of congressional supermajorities and the power to command sweeping electoral victories. When Roosevelt is deciding crucial questions by the end of the late 1930s, he has a phrase he uses, which is clear it with Sidney. Clear it with Sidney. That's Sidney Hillman, the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America fellow I was telling you about. Started off as an obscure Lithuanian immigrant attached to the Garland Fund and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, and by the late 30s is a dominant figure in a coalition that has congressional majorities that dwarf anything that the students here have ever seen in their lifetimes, even when they were infants. I mean, and we live in a world of polarization and tiny, constantly swinging back and forth majorities and control of the White House. And that produces, in some sense, danger for social movements who would attach themselves to presidents because of the need to make the Andrew Johnson decision in those moments of close elections. And so Roosevelt was in a radically different position to be able to rely on his movement, call on Sydney, in a way that Lincoln was not, and that no president in recent years has been able to either.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. My question concerns today. Reich wrote about the work of nations in the early 1990s. Then there was free trade and American industrial base hollowed out. Unions today at 7 or 8%, which gave rise to Magna, among many, many other things. Look forward. What is AI going to do to jobs? And what policy pronouncements do we need to think about as a country and really as a world and deal with that disruptive effect?
That's a great question. It's one I've been thinking about a lot in talking about this most recent book. The labor movement produced, let's call it, we're at a university, so I'm going to use too fancy a phrase, but an epistemological political unit. It was a way of connecting large numbers of people to knowledge, to knowledge about the world they lived in through trustworthy, reliable intermediaries. The union wasn't going to lie to the members because if the contract didn't work, I mean, the whole thing would collapse, right? There was accountability and stakes. There's a way in which the union helped to support a certain kind of politics that connected everyday people to the world they lived in. I don't think we have that right now. I don't think we have that. There are not ways in which ordinary people are connected up through trustworthy agents who have a fiduciary relationship with accountability to them. Outside of politics, and the coming AI revolution promises to make that even clearer by essentially making. I mean, if you listen to the most wild-eyed accounts, to make labor not a relevant category in thinking about the way we connect to one another as people, as citizens, as human beings in communities. And so I have been interested to see some experiments in thinking about what's the next category that connects us together, if not labor. One experiment that's happened on the left in the last 15 years is the idea that maybe it's debt. Students, you're all in debt. This is an incredibly expensive place. Educational debt became an organizing mode for a generation. It started with a book by the wild anarchist anthropologist David Graeber. It was picked up by a group of activists, and then it made it to the Biden administration and became law until the Supreme Court got involved. I am a little skeptical about whether debt is the kind of category that can connect people together really in the way that labor once did. Some people are in debt because they've been exploited, and others are in debt because they're exploiting others. It's just a true fact about debt. It doesn't distinguish in the way that labor once did. There's also candidates on the right. I think that the America First project is an effort to identify a unit that connects people together at scale, such that you can win elections with it, and it purports to connect people together in a shared economic interest. The Industrial Labor Union was an effort to connect people together in the relevant unit that would match mass production capitalism, and maybe in the era of geopolitical trade wars and tariffs, the nation state is the relevant economic unit. That's the bid I see from the America First MAGA crew. And honestly, it's been more successful than anything the left has had to offer, even though it's shot through with contradictions, difficulties, and hypocrisies. So, yeah.
So, Irasta, this is perfect. I'd love to hear a little bit more.
Okay, sorry. This voice, disembodied.
About this social movement, Harold. Because I mean, it strikes me, I guess when I heard you compare America First / MAGA to the abolition movement and the labor union movement, I was a little bit surprised because, of course, both of those movements had a strong pre-existing character. Roosevelt didn't wish the labor movement into existence. But I take it that the America First MAGA movement really, in some sense, was created by Donald Trump. And so can you say a little bit more about how does that change our interpretation of them?
It's a great question. So at the end, when I toggled back to the present there at the end, I flirted with this idea. That is to say, I took the position that there was a swirl of dissatisfaction and grievances that had a inchoate but identifiable formation, which were then summoned into political usefulness by the great communicator on Twitter and Truth Social, or wherever it is now. I think that's a plausible story, that there was a movement that was identifiable. In some ways, the election of Barack Obama might have been a barometer of it. Barack Obama, not a Democratic Party insider. In some way, he beats Hillary Clinton. Why? Because of the Iraq War disaster that Hillary Clinton is too indelibly attached to, that he can separate himself from. So maybe there's a movement. But what if there's not? What if there's not? I hear this idea. What if actually we're in a moment in which the communicators are so powerful that they can generate from thin air movements of their own? Well, that's not a world in which the movements will be able to pressure the presidents into one thing or another. The difficulty there is then you have to explain Minnesota. I don't think Donald Trump wanted Minnesota. I don't think he cares enough to want Minnesota. I think he wants poll numbers and the Dow Jones to stay high. So that would be we could be, and I tried to advert to this possibly at the very end, we could be in a radically new space in which the technologies of the office, the bully pulpit gone algorithmic, put us in a new dynamic.
Well, I just want to say thank you again to Professor Witt, thank you to Professor Calabresi, and thank you all for coming to this year's Lincoln Lecture on Constitutional Law. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Linda.